believe that Paul's evening programs are without a doubt some that are the most ambitious, and certainly, as you can see tonight, the most successful. He is a master at encouraging his guests to speak. Traditionally, he prepares his own introductions, and one thing that he always asks his guests to do is to provide him with 7 words they feel define themselves. So tonight, I decided to have a little bit of fun and asked Paul for those 7 words. He replied thusly: Mother always said, 2 ears, 1 mouth. Wise words indeed from the man who has made our lions roar. Paul, we are very lucky to have your 2 ears and your 1 mouth working so deftly on behalf of the New York Public Library. Our luck continues this evening as we welcome Edmund de Waal. Mr. de Waal was apprenticed as a potter in Canterbury. He studied in Japan and then read English at Cambridge. His porcelain is now in 30 international museum collections. Most recently, he has created a major installation at the V&A, the dome of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, as well as work at the Tate. He is working on exhibitions here in the United States and for several other museums in the UK, as well as on many commissions for private clients. He has written widely on art and ceramics. He is currently a professor of ceramics at the University of Westminster. His book, The Hare with Amber Eyes, A Family's Century of Art and Loss, was published in 2010 by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. It is a very big story about a collection of 264 small, very small objects called netsuke, Japanese figures carved from mostly wood or ivory. This is a collection which became Mr. de Waal's compass on a personal journey of family discovery. As he navigates the collective voyage of these figures through the drama of his own family's odyssey, beginning in Odessa in 1857, on to Paris in 1870, Vienna at the turn of the century, and through both world wars, on to Tokyo in 1947, and finally back to London, to the home of today's storyteller. His observation and insights into the relationship between people and objects, places and time, are compelling to any of us who have either given or received an object deemed significant enough to hold on to its own story, its own meaning. Mr. de Waal himself writes, "How objects are handed on is all about storytelling. I am giving you this because I love you, or because it was given to me, or because I bought it somewhere special, because you might take care of it, because it will complicate your life, because it will make someone else envious. There is no easy story in legacy." Thank you very much for taking the time away from your potter's wheel to write what is not an easy story, but a pleasure to read. You spent time conducting research in many of the world's greatest libraries, and we are so very honored to have you welcome with all of the people in this room to this library tonight. Paul Holdengräber, I have one more thing to say about you. You have many, many, many too many good programs. Quickly, because there will be information about this on the way out, and I wanted to make sure you knew that following tonight, next week we have here in this very room John Lithgow in conversation with Bill Moyers on October 11th, Harry Belafonte on October 12th, Tom Brokaw on November 1st, Diane Keaton on November 14th. She will be reading from her new memoir, Then Again. Joan Didion on November 21st in conversation with Sloane Crosley, and Mary Beard, our annual Robert B. Silvers lecture guest, who will be talking on Do the Classics Have a Future? So we hope you will join us. And thank you so much for welcoming Edmund de Waal.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much for this very warm introduction, Susan and Tony. I really appreciate it very, very deeply. And I'm extremely honored and pleased to have you here. I always say that I don't believe that one should have chumminess on stage, so I will try to restrain myself as much as your book has managed to be poised and restrained. But in order to get ourselves started, I thought that the most important thing I could ask you to do is actually to read from it. And I've asked you to read some specific passages because I think they will set the stage for tonight.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here in this beautiful and scary room. Luckily, I can't see anything because the light's in my face, so I'm going to just talk to one person out there and read. Thank you. It could write itself, I think, this kind of story. A few stitched together wistful anecdotes, more about the Orient Express, a bit of wandering around Prague or somewhere equally photogenic, some clippings from Google on ballrooms in the Belle Epoque, and it would come out as nostalgic and thin. And I'm not entitled to nostalgia about all that lost wealth and glamour from a century ago, and I'm not interested in thin. I want to know what the relationship has been between this wooden object that I'm rolling between my fingers, hard and tricky and Japanese, and where it's been. I want to be able to reach to the handle of the door and turn it and feel it open. I want to walk into each room where this object has lived, to feel the volume of the space, to know what pictures were on the walls, how the light fell from the windows, and I want to know whose hands it's been in and what they felt and thought about it, if they thought about it. I want to know what it's witnessed. Melancholy, I think, is a sort of default vagueness, a get-out clause, a smothering lack of focus. And this Netsuke is a small, tough explosion of exactitude, and it deserves this kind of exactitude in return. And all this matters because my job is to make things. How objects get handled, used, and handed on is not just a mildly interesting question for me, it's my question. I have made many, many thousands of pots. I'm very bad at names. I mumble and fudge, but I'm good on pots. I can remember the weight and the balance of a pot and how its surface works with its volume. I can read how an edge creates tension or loses it. I can feel as if it's been made at speed or with diligence, if it has warmth. I can see how it works with objects that sit nearby, how it displaces a small part of the world around it. And I can also remember if something invited touch with the whole hand or just the fingers, was an object that asks you to stay away. It's not that handling something is better than not handling it. Some things in the world are meant to be looked at from a distance and not fumbled around with. And as a potter, I find it a bit strange when people who have my pots talk of them as if they're alive. I'm not sure if I can cope with the afterlife of what I've made. But some objects do seem to retain the pulse of their making. This intrigues me. There's a breath of hesitancy before touching or not touching, a strange moment. If I choose to pick up this small white cup with its single chip near the handle, will it figure in my life? A symbolical object, this cup that is more ivory than white, too small for morning coffee, not quite balanced, could become part of my life of handled things. It could fall away into the territory of personal storytelling, the sensuous, sinuous intertwining of things with memories. I could put it away, or I could pass it on. Because how objects are handed on is all about storytelling. I'm giving you this because I love you, or because it was given to me, because I bought it somewhere special, because you will care for it, because it will complicate your life, because it will make someone else envious. There is no easy story in legacy. What is remembered and what is forgotten? There can be a chain of forgetting, the rubbing away of previous ownership, as much as the slow accretion of stories. What is being passed on to me with all these small Japanese objects? I realize that I've been living with this Netsuke business for far too long. I can either anecdotalize it for the rest of my life, my odd inheritance from a beloved aged relative, or go out and find what it means. One evening, I find myself at dinner telling some academics what I know of the story and feeling slightly sickened by how poised it sounds. I hear myself entertaining them, and the story echoes back in their reactions. It isn't just getting smoother, it's getting thinner. I must sort it out now or it will disappear. Being busy is no excuse. I've just finished an exhibition of my porcelain in a museum and can postpone a commission for a collector if I play my cards right. I've negotiated with my wife and cleared my diary. 3 or 4 months should see me right. That gives me enough time to go and see Jiro in Japan and to visit Paris and Tokyo. And as my grandmother and my great-uncle Iggy have died, I must also ask for my father's help to get started. He's 80, and kindness itself, and will look out family things for me, he says, for background information. He seems delighted that one of his 4 sons is interested. There isn't much, he warns me. He comes down to my studio with a small cache of photographs, 40-odd. He also brings 2 thin blue files of letters, to which he's added yellow post-it notes, mostly legible. A family tree annotated by my grandmother sometime in the 1970s, and the membership book for the Vienna Club in 1935, and in a supermarket bag, a pile of Thomas Mann novels with inscriptions. We lay them out on the long table in my office, up the stairs. You are now the keeper of the family archive, he tells me. And I look at the piles, and I'm not sure how funny I should find this. I ask, somewhat desperately, if there's any more material. He looks again in the evening in his small flat in the courtyard of retired clergymen where he lives, and he telephones me to say that he's found another volume of Thomas Mann. This journey is going to be more complicated than I'd thought, but I can't start with a complaint. I know very little of substance about Charles Efrissi, the first collector of the Netscape, but I found out where he lived in Paris. So I put the Netscape in my pocket and set out.
And I see you put one on the table, the very famous Here with Amber Eyes.
This is three tumbling rats.
Let me see.
I have to tell you, can I tell you a story?
Can you imagine if I said no?
I finished this book, and we don't know what to call the book. So I call a family conference with my children, and I say, we all have a vote. Bad mistake in any family. And I say, we're going to call the book after our Netscape. What should we call it? This is 5 years of taking this book. And my children say, we've got an idea for the title of the book, Dad. We should call it The Rat. And I say, I'm never, ever calling a book The Rat.
The reason I wanted you to read this passage is because I wanted people to get a sense of the way in which so much of the book seems to be about the importance of touch, the importance of things, the heaviness of things, the fear also that things might become thin. All of that made me think that reading this prologue is like reading your manifesto.
It's a manifesto. It's a very.
For what?
It's a simple manifesto. It's a manifesto for things and against things. It's a manifesto for making space to think about tactility, about the world of objects, about how much of the world they displace, about their presence in our lives, and in some way, the resonance in which objects have. But that's one thing. That's the good thing. It's an absolute manifesto about exactitude and about returning to the world of things and engaging with it with intelligence and passion, which is something that doesn't happen. The second thing, it's a manifesto against thinness. It's an absolute cry against the danger of nostalgia, the thinness of nostalgia, the make-believe, the fantasy that sort of swirls round the inexact, the melancholic, the untactile.
A manifesto against nostalgia.
Yeah. Sign up. Sign up for
well,
that.
you know, I need that class because I feel that most of my life is lived under the sign of melancholia and nostalgia. Yeah. And how at the same time do you espouse the importance of things, the passion, the notion in some way, I think, like Benjamin in Unpacking My Library, when he says that possession is perhaps the deepest relationship we can have to things. And at the same time, you keep a distance from them, because not keeping a distance from them is being possessed by them.
You could be completely possessed by them, but you can be completely, I mean, that's, people who've lost things are completely possessed, can be completely possessed by what they've lost. You know, you can, the whole thing about a collection is that it's always diasporic. Any collection you make is this temporal, delicate attempt to keep something together in the world. This fantasy that you can keep things together, you can keep a world together, you can keep a family together, you can keep these objects together. And things fall apart. Things are intrinsically diasporic. They wander, they go, they get stolen, they get given away, they get broken. And so I love the world of things. I make things. So I'm always caught in this moment of the creation and the dispersion. And telling this story, I'm trying to, all the time to kind of navigate this extraordinary story about accumulation and this extraordinary story of loss simultaneously. Now, if Paul, if I wrote another, that's probably my wife actually, if I tried to tell it, if I wrote a book which channeled the melancholia of loss, I would be doing, it would be a criminal act. It would be, what I would be doing.
So unpack that idea.
Okay.
Unpack the idea that it would be a criminal act, because it's certainly a crime that has been committed many times.
And again and again and again and again. That's why memoir is so bloody difficult, because
memory is bloody difficult.
No, memoir. Memory is great. Memory is what we have. Memory is what we is our breathing in and breathing out. It's our systole and diastole. It's what we live with. Memoir has this tendency towards the elegiac, which is incredibly difficult. So, okay, melancholia, nostalgia, the elegy. You have this incredible dynastic Jewish family who loses everything. Okay, what's that a story about? It's an arc of nostalgia. It's, you know, it's all about balls in the fin de siècle. It's all about, you know, the big ballroom and the small ballroom, and it's all about guest lists and Renoir and Proust and except it isn't. You know, there's all that, but that's not the story. If I just told this story, people would go, you know what? We've read it. We know exactly what this is about. This is all about someone else grandstanding about their loss. And that's not the point. I'm not entitled to sit here 70 years after the Anschluss and say, you know what, it was tragic. That's not the point of the book. That's not why I set out on the journey. I set out on the journey to give dignity to real people over a huge period of time and try and understand how they lived and what they were silent about. And that's something completely different from melancholia. Completely different from melancholia.
I sense in you certainly the passion of the collector, but also an anger. Anger against the kind of story that has been written precisely after the Anschluss about great families and great dynasties.
The world doesn't need another dynastic, epic miniseries. You know, it just doesn't. You know, we all know what a room full of pretty people in ball dresses looks like. You know, I don't want to inflict that on people I care about, you know, and readers and alike. I just don't want to do that. And so you know, the challenge was considerable because there's an awful lot of that material that I can, so I have to find a different way, and that's why my pact with myself is to do it through tactility, it's to make it real through my hands and through my walking. I mean,
and the notion of tactility is so important,
yeah,
because the tactile inebriation in some way you feel from these objects, the notion that the word tact itself, to be touched by, to be tactile, is a sense in some way that has been, I think one could say, defavored.
Yes.
Where's
the literature on touch? I mean, you know, that's...
Well, you say you want to write the history of touch.
Yeah, I mean, okay, this is New York, I'm allowed to be ambitious. I want to write the history of touch. I want to write the history of touch. It hasn't been written.
You mentioned Rilke in the book, and I remember Rilke in the letters to Cézanne says, has anybody written the history of blue, of a color?
Yes.
You have taken upon yourself to write in a tactful way the history of touch.
Yes.
How do you go about it?
How do you go about it? Well, for a start, you get it wrong. I mean, I got it so completely wrong. I mean, I got it wrong on so many levels. Okay, you want to know that I got it wrong first. The first book I wrote is academic. The first book I tell people about Japonism and about assimilation. Okay, and I'm not in the book. The second huge problem.
So do you miss yourself
I miss myself.
in that first version?
What I do is to write a book where I'm so scared by what I've undertaken that I keep myself out of it. I'm absolutely petrified by this idea of being present. So then I have to start again, and what I do is to say, actually, genuinely, what happens? What happens when you this is not emotion.
What happens when you're looking towards me?
It is not. Excuse me.
Please. When talking about the Nitsuke, you talk about them in Paris, first of all, under the sign of Charles. And I want you to obviously talk about Charles. And he talks about it as plus gras, plus simple, plus caresse. Yeah. I think that's very close to what we're trying to describe here, plus caresse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about this pact I made myself to actually go and discover the life of these objects in the hands of the people who manipulated them. Of course, what I'm also trying to do there is to do the thing about what does the place do to the person in it. So it's not just the person touching the object, but the place touching the person. And that's Jewish. That's the story of how do you make sense of where you are. So I'm trying to do two rather ambitious things at the same time. I'm trying to tell a story about what it's like to pick up an object in 1880 with your friends after dinner, after a good dinner, and what does that mean? But I'm also trying to say what's it like to be touched by the place? What's it like to be a person who's born in Odessa and is given an apartment and makes this life in Paris? You know, what does that do to you? How does that touch you?
The relationship, I want us to unravel this story because it is an extraordinary story, and you speak about yourself very much under the sign, I think, of Benjamin as a flaneur, as vagabonding, as digressing. I mean, really, and in this particular way, digression is really the sunshine of narrative. And but before we get to that, I would like for you to address this relationship between being Jewish and collecting.
Okay.
Because in some way, one might say that the wandering Jew can't be a great collector.
Yeah. I mean, this is it. I mean, my journey is a journey where I keep finding people who make a place for themselves, become Parisian, become Viennese, become Japanese. And what do? The first thing they do is to start to collect.
Collecting as a way of
collecting is a way of saying that you're there, that you're not moving, that you have got more than that sort of satchel on your back. You know, that's what collecting is about. It's saying, it's staking a place in the world, and it's taking a place in the world, and so the history of this story of Jewish collecting is completely about staying put. It's making that bet on assimilation and on belonging. It's saying, this is the place I belong, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm here, I'm not wandering, and now I'm not wandering, I need pictures, and I need objects, and I need a library. And so that's the story, and you know, it happens again and again and again and again. Each time members of my family stop and adopt a place, they start to collect. Not just acquire, but collect.
Not hoard, but systematically collect.
Yeah. They project themselves out into the world of things and make sense of themselves through collections. And I completely understand that. It's taking a bet on belonging.
And you have, since we're in a library at this present moment, in this great hall, you have this extraordinary line of a non-Jewish writer, namely Victor Hugo, talking about libraries being a bet, and a bet against dispersion.
Exactly. And the book is my journey. It's a journey also through it's a journey through objects, and it's a journey through books as objects, which isn't to say that you don't read them, but the books are objects, but books are things. And so it's a book of passion, about my passion and the passion of the people of my family, to read, to hold, to possess books, and to write them. I mean, Charles, this great flaneur, this man, this vagabond, but he's also vagabonding for a purpose. He's vagabonding in order to write a beautiful book about Dürer. And then
You're not taken by him though at the beginning.
Well, how can you? I mean, for goodness sake, he's
really
22. He's 22, and he buys a Medici bed for his bedroom. I mean, can you think of any more bling than that? He buys a Medici bed, and it's got an M for Medici embroidered in Renaissance, and he takes out the M and puts E. I mean, really,
that's ambitious.
Really. He buys a carpet from a Savonnerie, a beautiful Savonnerie carpet of the Golden Winds, a famous carpet, which was woven for the Louvre, for the Palais of the Louvre in 1720, and he gets it cut down to size for his salon. I mean, this is decorating on a kind of Upper East Side level. I mean, this is kind of, oh God,
that was a moment we won't forget here. But
cut that.
But we'll cut that out of the tape. I promise you.
What I meant was anyway.
What you meant was.
So,
what you meant was, in fact, I think to some extent, to put it in context, is that Charles at the beginning is someone you dislike.
Yes.
Very strongly,
Very
actually.
strongly.
But slowly, very much as this collection becomes warmer to you and you become closer to it, you warm to him.
But Paul, I warm to him because I start to read him. And I start to read this man who, and at the beginning, he's I can just feel that gaucherie, that kind of,
Who is he?
What he does in his early essays about art history, he puts in everything. He tells you everything. And you think, I know what that's like. That's being 24. That's being 24 and you're really showing off. You really want to show off. And then there's this voice that starts coming through, and this voice is one of extraordinary, poetic precision, where he looks at objects, he looks at paintings, and he's in conversation with his art, and he makes it alive. And so how can you not fall in love with someone who makes you alive in the presence of art? I mean, that's a great, great gift. I mean, he makes you feel you're in the same room as Bert Morisot, or that you actually want to go and look at Donatello again. I mean, doesn't happen. I mean, that's tremendous. So I start to love him because I can hear his voice, and then, you know, and then I'm lost.
You're lost, and in part you're lost by what he ends up collecting.
Of course.
And the relationship, to come back to Jews and collecting, a subject I'm really very interested in particular because the relationship between collecting and wandering is benefits from the diminutive, from the small, from the fact that this is, if you don't mind my touching it,
please.
Actually, I think it's an important point, is that the book ends very much on the notion that your children, who you mentioned early on, are able to touch this at any given moment. So I'm curious what the relationship is between these Japanese objects that are so small and so easy to lose, and the relationship of being Jewish.
Two things. Well, actually one thing. Probably two. One. These things are completely sensuous. They're utterly, utterly beguiling. And what they do is when you pick them up and you hand them to someone, as soon as you hand them to someone, you begin. So it's absolutely that synapse of storytelling. That's how all stories begin. You pick up an object, you put it down, you start a story. You hand someone a story, you look them in the eyes, and you're away. But there's another thing, and this is the Jewish thing, is that these are foreign objects. These have an elsewhere, and that's the point. When you look at the things that people are collecting, there's this strange excitement about elsewhere, about this. It's not exoticism. Exoticism is too cheap a word, and it's those histories of Japanism are dull, you know, because when Japanese art gets to Paris, it's intoxicatingly, genuinely exciting, because it brings a whole new area of sensuality and a different way of breathing, a different way of framing the world. And so imagine being first generation, you've moved from Odessa and you're living in Paris, and you've got this new art. I mean, it has to be something that makes sense of elsewhere for you.
Tell us a little bit more, if you would, about this man who occupies the first chapter of your book, Charles. And he is not only someone who is collecting, but he is also the model for someone in a very, very great book.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, I said that in the preface, that this book would take me 3 or 4 months, tops. Okay, and after a year, I'm in an archive in Paris, and I find letters by the Impressionist to Charles and a dinner menu in the Louvre. I must say, Parisian archivists are shit. They are so horrible and unpleasant, but they really are the most unpleasant people in the world. But, you know, I find these things, and they're wonderful. They're wonderful, wonderful things, and I'm lost. And then there's the story about Manet's asparagus. This, you know, and there's this beautiful bundle of asparagus, and it's 800 francs. And Charles buys it, and he sends 1,000. And on Tuesday, to the Rue Monceau, 81 Rue Monceau, a little canvas is delivered with a single asparagus. And this one has slipped from the bundle, is written on the back. And I remembered the story, and of course it's in Proust. And this is where my life gets really complicated, because then I realize that all those paintings I've tracked down, which are in the Met and in Chicago and in Cologne and everywhere, all those paintings turn up in À la recherche de temps perdu. Proust is going up those staircases. He's working as a secretary for Charles. Charles is dedicating a book to him. Charles is encouraging him to write. And Swan, for God's sake, is based partly on my Charles. And that's another year gone. I mean, that is another year gone, because how the hell am I going to write this book, which is an anti-memoir?
And which now has become, one of the main characters has become a character
in the book. Exactly.
And you are yourself writing your recherche.
Exactly. So
you are in trouble.
I'm in trouble. I mean, real trouble.
So in order to alleviate the trouble, you use this extraordinary quotation at the beginning of the book, which I will read.
Good.
Even when one is no longer attached to things, it's still something to have been attached to them, because it was always for reasons which other people didn't grasp. Well, now that I'm a little too weary to live with other people, these old feelings, so personal and individual, that I had in the past, seem to me, it's a mania of all collectors, very precious. I open my heart to myself like a sort of vitrine and examine one by one those love affairs of which the world can know nothing. And of this collection, to which I'm now much more attached than to my others, I say to myself, rather as Mazarin said of his books, but in fact without the least distress, that it will be very tiresome to have to leave it all.
I think we should just go. I mean, that's just the most. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? It's. I mean, how can we talk about? I mean, how can you?
We can try.
Okay, we can try. Okay.
Tiresome.
I know.
Tiresome and vitrine.
Yes.
Talk about the. Let's leave the word. Shall we? Which one would you like to start with?
Should we go for vitrines?
Vitrine. Yeah. Let's go for vitrine, and we'll go for tiresome later. Okay, as people get so more and more.
As they leave, we'll get to tiresome. Yeah. Vitrines are really truly interesting, and you know, my other really ambitious take is that this is a cultural history of vitrines, because you know, I did this whole boring polemic stuff about not having my work in glass cases, and now I make all my work for glass cases. So, but vitrines are very, very interesting, because vitrines are absolutely for opening up. They objects are suspended in space in a vitrine. So they tantalize by you not touching them, and they offer the possibility of this transgression of opening them up.
Which you love that.
Yeah,
I mean, because in a way your book is also an attempt at getting closer and closer to these Netsuki. And there's a lot of foreplay, one might say, as one slowly gets closer and closer to them, and you describe that movement.
Yes, and I mean there's, but the yes, and the vitrines, you know, the joy of the vitrine, the joy of this glass case, in Charles's apartment in the Rue Morceau, and then of course later in Vienna, and then even later in Tokyo, and now in whatever, this is that it, at every single point it has a different way of opening up. You can imagine Charles opening it up as a host, and the grandeur of that gesture.
When would that have been?
1880. You know, after dinner, you've got Renoir around for dinner or something. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, he gave good parties. You know, you've got, you know, Montesquieu late. You know, he's on the stairs. But you know, whatever. But you've got, but it has that kind of life there, but it has a completely different life, of course, in Vienna. And that sense of different kinds of play, so that play works in all kinds of ways. And so that's something that really interested me, which is, you open it up and something happens. It's a threshold.
The objects go, Charles has the objects, he buys them in one bundle.
Yes.
264
Yeah.
Nitsuke. What attracted him to them?
I think he knew exactly what they would do in his house. I think he knew exactly how they could work. I want to believe that he was charmed and delighted and intrigued by them. I think he was also showing off. I think it's an extraordinary purchase. I don't know whether it was one in the eye for his brothers, or showing off to his fabulous mistress. On which point, I've discovered that I have many more French cousins than I thought, because if we're allowed to talk about the afterlife of this ridiculous book, is that not only do my Parisian cousins, as well as obviously my Viennese family, have more expansive relationships than I make play with in this book, but out of the woodwork, since the book has been published, I have a wonderful set of new cousins.
When you say he wants to show off,
Yeah.
For whom?
I think there's an element of the grand chord here, of saying, look, actually, I think there's an element of bling, of actually saying, this, I've got all this, and now you can get your hands on it too. I think don't you see that? I think that's what's happening.
My little idea in my head as I ask you that question, without wanting you to give me that answer, but thinking that I might suggest it to you, is it has again something to do with the desire to be assimilated. So in one way, showing off is a way of exterior, making something exterior and a facade, and showing the world how fabulous your taste is.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm a Jew in France, in a world that is writing about me as Goncourt did, in a way that is anything but kind.
Yes, but I think that happens later. I think in the sense that I really, at the end of the century, when Charles builds this newer, bigger house, vastly bigger house, and he starts collecting empire furniture there's a lot of it in the Getty. There's Gustave Moreau's like that, and there's Sèvres, and there's Gobelin tapestries, and at that point, Paul, what he's doing, he's saying, I am completely French. He's surrounding himself with French objects. He's channeling being French in a completely straightforward way. And it's at the moment of the Dreyfus affair. I mean, I look at this collection he puts together at the end of the century, and he's more French than the French. He is absolutely saying, I am a Frenchman. I have the Légion d'honneur. I walk down to my club, I'm French. And that's the same time that bricks are coming through his window, and there's the daily broadsheet excoriating the family.
And there lies the danger. Is that true? The danger of considering that as someone that doesn't have a home, you belong somewhere. Because those objects then move from Paris to Vienna into a family that also believes that beyond anything, it is Austrian. It is Viennese.
I look at my great-grandfather, and he is a Viennese. He's born in Odessa. He is more Viennese than the Viennese. He loves the emperor. He builds that house on the Ringstrasse, and it's a block of the Ringstrasse. That's a house which says you're not moving. And what he's saying is that he believes in this great imperial city, and this is where he is. And he loves that city. That's where he belongs, and that's where this vitrine goes.
And at first, that city loves him.
Yes,
at certain moments.
Yes, I mean
But then what happens? I mean, you speaking of loss, you speak of a tremendous loss. He loses everything, and everybody loses everything after him.
1938. I mean, when I started this journey and made this sort of pact with myself to continue to the end, I always had this thing, this anxiety, this terror, really, about whether or not I would be able to write about the Anschluss. Everyone has written about the Anschluss. And it's everyone else's story, and it's my story too, but it's how can I write about that period of time? I mean, it's such hubris to attempt to write that story. And so there was this huge problem for me about, as a person, as a writer, on how do I make, not how do I make sense of it, but how do I actually write it? How do I actually sit down and write about what happened? And so that's where I have to do it through touch.
Because touch gives you...
That's my way of doing it. It's my way of doing it. So I wasn't going to write a history of what happened except through this taking apart of a family through the objects which gave them meaning. Because the Anschluss is the first attempt to take away from people their objects, and then you take away their homes, and then you take away their place, and then you take away their story. It all begins there. And so I start my story with them taking away the objects.
Yes, he says in a post-war interview on his role at the bank, of course he bought them out. They needed cash for the Reichsflugsteuer, the Reich flight tax. They offered me their shares urgently because this was the fastest way to get cash. The price Efrusi and Wiener price to get out was totally appropriate. It was 508,000 Reichsmarks, plus the 40,000 Aryanization tax, of course. So, on the 12th of August 1938, Efrusi & Co. is taken off the business register. In the records it says, singularly, and in capital letters, erased. 3 months later, the name is changed to Bankhaus Steinhauser. Under its new name, it's revalued, and under its new Gentile ownership, it is worth 6 times as much as under the Jewish ownership. There's no longer a Palais Efrusi, and there's no longer an Efrusi bank in Vienna. The Efrusi family has been cleansed from the city. It is on this visit that I go to the Jewish archive in Vienna, the one seized by Eichmann to check up on the details of a marriage. I look through a ledger to find Victor, and there's an official red stamp across the first name. It reads, Israel. An edict decreed that all Jews had to take new names. Someone has gone through every single name in the lists of Viennese Jews and stamped them Israel for the men, Sarah for the women. I am wrong. The family is not erased, but written over. And finally, it is that makes me cry. And I mean, that when I reached that moment,
I have to say, I think that's really unfair.
Unfair.
I mean, you know, here I am. It still makes me cry. I mean, you know, it's yes.
But you wrote the book in some way toward against that.
Yes. Well, you know what? I don't know what I was doing with this book. I mean, I write this book. I write this book because it's a real attempt in places and archives and museums to work out what is still humming there in the family story. It's trying to make sense of all those silences, all those erasures, all those things which are palimpsests, where a thing has been written over. It's the moment when you get to the file and you look into the file you've called up from the archive, and it has, you know, this is the file you need, and you get to the page, and the page has been ripped out in 1938. And that's all that story, which is a story that many, many, many people share, is my story too. But when I write the book, what I'm trying to do at every point is to do it with exactitude. Is to do it,
about to say that,
do it because you can't do this story vaguely. You can't make it general and melancholic. You can't. You've got to go back and do it properly.
And what you're after is to find in some way, I mean, when you write in that introduction, this is my question. Your question is to find what it felt like to, in particular with these objects, to be manipulating those objects in a particular context, be it Paris, be it Vienna, or be it Tokyo.
It's worth doing. You know, I mean, it's bloody hard work, but it was worth doing. It was worth doing because it wasn't ultimately the story that I thought it was, you know, and that's always a more interesting story. You know, when I set out my stall with the skeletal thing that I was given by Iggy, of what had happened, and the non-skeletal Netsuke, I thought I knew what I was going to find. And I thought I knew why I was doing it, but I didn't.
What did you think?
I thought I was in control. I mean, I thought I was in control of the material. It's a classic screw-up. You know, I thought I genuinely could handle the material and accommodate it and walk through. I could stroll through this family history. And what I find at all times is you know, and I'm in the book, is this exhilaration and this moment of complete, utter shock.
What is strongest in the book to me is the feeling of utter responsibility you feel. And the subtitle in the American edition speaks to that notion of being an heir. With being an heir comes a deep responsibility.
Well, Goethe says you earn your inheritance.
You know,
you've probably got that written down too.
I do have that very well. I have that quotation in some way.
I'm sure
what from your father's
He knows his Goethe better
no.
than me.
What in the Faust quotation is it? What from your fathers you received as heir, acquire if you would possess it.
Yes.
Is that the line you were?
You're better than me. You've got it exact. I can't. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
And then I was thinking of Lampedusa, who has this extraordinary line in Ligea where he says, I hold old families in high regard. They possess a memory, minute, it's true, but anyway greater than that of others.
I get you can't cap Lampedusa. I mean, certainly, but I mean the inheritance. The inheritance. Well, the responsibility. I mean, again, that grows. You know. I mean, it's that strange thing, which is that I kind of, when I get given this collection, I think, well, you know, I must make sure it's well looked after.
When it was handed over to you.
Yes, so it's sort of that sort of sense of being a custodian, and then there's the challenge, and then there was absolutely, damn it, that, you know, he knew what he was doing. It was a real loaded gun, and you know, I've just been called a PK, what's a preacher's kid? Is that right? I grew up in the most establishment Anglican family you can believe. I grew up next to Canterbury Cathedral in a deanery with, you know, evensong and bells all the time, and pictures of deans on the wall, and you know, that's my inheritance. So that's what I think I inherit, is this Philip Larkin world. And I don't expect Joseph Roth. So, you know, go figure. It's bloody complicated. You know, I grew up knowing my way around the Anglican prayer book.
Then this collection was handed over to you. It was handed over to you in the most unexpected way.
Yes, and I mean...
Is it a burden?
No, I've put the burden down. I mean, the burden, you know what, I've written this book. I mean, I think I've discharged my obligations to my family. I really do. You know... When you describe Vienna at one particular moment, you say there's something sticky, and that word struck me because in my own family history, with two Viennese parents, one father who turned 93 yesterday and a mother who turned 87 a month ago, having escaped Vienna, spending the war years in Haiti. And when I turned 18, the one gift I wanted from my father was to go to his Vienna. And we went for a week to his Vienna. And with his index finger, he indicated everything that he knew, and everything he showed me, was a trip in absence, because everything he showed was no longer there. And I was filled with these stories of Stefan Zweig and Peter Altenberg and Joseph Roth and all of those people. And I got more and more depressed as I went along, because everything he showed me wasn't there. Yes.
And I said to him, but what you're showing me isn't there. Isn't this very, in some way, depressing? And he said, not at all. I am here. It isn't at all that way for me, because I'm here to tell you the story.
You see, that's just fantastic. That's just fantastic. That's absolutely, and that nails restitution. You see, that nails restitution, because this is it, okay? Because, you know, we all want our pictures back, and we're going to get them back. You know, restitution is about getting the things back we've lost. But you know what? Vienna, we restitute stories to Vienna. Vienna is a shadow of what it was. It's lost all its stories, and so writing our stories and taking them back is restitution in a really, really powerful way, and that is taking control where we can take control. That's a really powerful thing. So your father is right. And sticky.
Sticky. Because sticky, I mean, just because I never got to sticky.
Yeah.
Sticky, the issue with sticky is that my mother abhors this stickiness.
Yeah.
She finds it, I mean, she adores Thomas Bernhard because precisely he unsticks it all.
Yes.
And the stickiness, the heaviness, but the heaviness not in terms of the contrary of thinness, which you write against. You write against the thinness, the cliches of Vienna. You write, I mean, at one moment in the book you say extraordinarily that in some way the story you're telling about Vienna is a story of other people. It isn't your Vienna. And so this stickiness, I want you to address it.
I think you've addressed it beautifully. I don't know if I can say anything about Vienna which has your kind of body language. I mean, look at you. But you know, I mean, Vienna. Goodness, and the Viennese. I mean, let's get personal here. But it's sort of, you know, I mean, it's so difficult. It is so difficult because that sentimentality and that ability to add another layer, just another layer, and to wash it with Strauss, you know, is something that is poisonous. The book has come out in Germany and Austria.
I was going
last
to
week.
ask you about that.
And in 3 weeks' time, on the 20th of October, my father and my children and I are going to Vienna, and we're going to launch the book in Vienna. And I'm reading with my father in the Palais of Russie, which he hasn't been in since 1952. And then we are walking to the Jewish Museum, and we are going to launch the book. And the next day, my father is taking my children round Vienna. So ask me in a month.
What do your children know at this point about Vienna? How old are they?
They're 13 and 12 and 9. I mean, they know, and they haven't read the book yet, but that's fine. They've got time. But I don't know how to prepare them. I don't think I can prepare them for going with their grandfather to Vienna. I mean, enough's enough.
The passage I had you read at the very beginning about, in a way, the book, the subject beckoning you. You had to write this book in order to get the story out of you, and the story right, and the story told, and the collection safe. There's a relationship between telling the story and saving the collection.
Of course there is. I mean, that's why we write stories. Because the longevity of stories is comparable to the longevity of objects, and sometimes they intersect and sometimes they don't. And the rare moments when the stories and the objects come together is amazing. And you know, I'm a storyteller in the things I make, as well as through words. So I don't know. I don't want to seem grandiose.
But there's a relationship between, precisely, and you talk about this again and again, between your craft and storytelling.
Yes.
As it were, the marks on the pots are not unlike the marks. I mean, in this sense, it's very close to the story, to Benjamin's storyteller.
Yes. Yes, it is.
There is a way in which there is traces left. You were talking about these objects as highly things you manipulate, you touch.
It's also a series of bigger movements, because it's also a series of walks, and it's a series of walks around cities, rather deliberately and rather stupidly using guidebooks from the time that I was trying to work out. So I keep getting lost because I keep using Baedekers from 1870, and you know, stupid Englishman, you know, kind of, but that was part of it. So it's a series of walks, which is a different kind of movement. And so there's a shape. I mean, the book is a series of shapes. and I'm on some kind of spectrum because I kind of think about the work, the book as an object. It's sort of a made book.
These objects now find themselves in your home.
They do. They're in a vitrine at home.
And they have become more open than ever to manipulation.
Well, it's unlocked. It's unlocked. So I mean, there's no. I told my oldest son that he should think hard because there's a misery memoir for him when he's older about living with Netscape and not seeing his father and having to, the afterlife of this book. But they do. The kids can. It's not policed.
It's not
policed. It's not policed. It's open. It's there.
And the key to the vitrine is always there.
Yeah, why not? I mean, this is someone. Yeah. Sometimes things don't have to be in museums to have some kind of valency, some kind of value, some kind of life. And these ones aren't in museums.
Say something more about that. Because your work finds itself in many museums, and here you are in some way doing something quite opposite.
Yes, I'm not consciously contrarian. It's rather nice to be collected by museums. It makes me feel rather grand. The things I make for museums are my conversation about collections. They are real interrogations of how objects get put together, where they get placed, the gaps between them, how glass cases work, what's touchable and not touchable. It's about desire. A lot of my things are out of reach. They beckon you and you realize you can't move them around. A lot of my things are about diaspora. They don't fall apart. They stay together as groups. So a lot of the things I make at the moment, I'm making vitrines for God's sake at the moment, are very much in conversation with my book.
And one of the things that strikes me is this notion that the collection becomes interiorized, the notion of loss in that context. And since Rilke features quite prominently in the book, there's this line that I found where he says, "Now loss, however cruel, is powerless against possession, which it completes or even affirms. Loss is in fact nothing else than a second acquisition, but now completely interiorized and just as intense."
That's fantastic. I mean, that's fantastic. That's absolutely beautiful.
I'll give you another one.
May I allowed?
This is from
the most fun I've had on 10 days in America.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that I can.
This is better than Denver.
Among the lines we will remember is that this is better than Denver. But John Berger has this line which I adore, where he says, "Poetry can repair no loss, but it defies the space which separates, and it does this by its continual labor of reassembling what has been scattered."
Yes, yes, and that makes complete sense. That makes complete sense to me. I mean, but that makes complete sense of the people I loved. My grandmother, who had nothing after the war, and didn't feel the need to put it all back together again because she had it. And out of that loss, she becomes a letter writer. She becomes a person who makes connections across the world and keeps correspondence going, and becomes this extraordinary person who's able to not be possessed by loss. And the book is in honor of the people who managed, you know, many didn't, but who managed to make a really creative life for themselves and weren't destroyed by this loss.
In closing, I asked you too to come up with your 7 words.
The amount of preparation I had to do for this was... These are my 7 words. Actually, I still make pots, you know.
Thank you very much.